Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. Chapter 5. Several Adventures that Happened to the Author. The Execution of a Criminal. The Author Shews His Skills in Navigation. I should have lived happily enough in that country, if my littleness had not exposed me to several ridiculous and troublesome accidents, some of which I shall venture to relate. Glumdalclitch often carried me into the gardens of the court in my smaller box, and would sometimes take me out of it, and hold me in her hands, or set me down to walk. I remember, before the dwarf left the queen, he followed us one day in those gardens, and my nurse having set me down, he and I being close together, near some dwarf apple trees, I must needs shew my wit by the silly allusion between him and the trees, which happens to hold in their language as doth in ours. Whereupon the malicious rogue, watching his opportunity when I was walking under one of them, shook it directly over my head, by which a dozen apples, each of them near as large as a Bristol barrel, came tumbling about my ears. One of them hit me on the back as I had a chance to stoop, and knocked me down flat on my face. But I received no other hurt, and the dwarf was pardoned at my desire, because I had given the provocation. Another day, Glumdalclitch left me on the smooth grass plot to divert myself, while she was walking at some distance with her governess. In the meantime, I felt a violent shower of hail, and I was immediately forced of it, struck to the ground, and when I was down, the hailstones gave me such cruel bangs all over my body, as if I had been pelted with tennis balls. However, I made a shift to creep on all fours, and shelter myself by lying flat on my face and lee side on the border of a lemon thyme, but was so bruised from head to foot that I couldn't go abroad for 10 days. Neither is this at all to be wondered, because nature in that country observing by the same proportions through all her operations. A hailstone is near 1800 times as the ones large in Europe, which I can assert upon experience, having been so curious to weigh and measure them. But a more dangerous accident happened to me in the same garden, when my little nurse, believing she had put me in a secure place, which I often entreated her to do, that I might enjoy my own thoughts, and having left my box at home to avoid the trouble of carrying it, went to another part of the garden with her governess and some ladies of her acquaintance. While she was absent and out of hearing, a small white spaniel belonging to one of the chief gardeners, having got by accident into the garden, happened to range near the place where I lay, and the dog, following the scent, came directly up, taking me in his mouth, ran straight to his master, wagging his tail, and setting me gently on the ground. By good fortune he had been taught so well that I had been carried between his teeth without the least hurt, or even tearing my clothes. But the poor gardener, who knew me well, had great kindness for me, was in terrible fright. He gently took me up in both hands, and asked me how I did. But I was so amazed and out of breath that I could not speak a word. In a few minutes I came to myself, and he carried me safe to my little nurse, who by this time had returned to the place where she left me, and was in cruel agonies when I did not appear, nor answer when she called. Severely reprimanded the gardener on account of his dog, but things were hushed up, and never known at court, for the girl was afraid of the queen's anger, and truly, as to myself, I thought it would not be for my reputation that such story should go about. The accident should absolutely determine Glumdalclitch never to trust me abroad for the future out of her sight. I had been so long afraid of this resolution, therefore concealed from some of her little unlucky adventures that happened in those times when I left by myself. Once a kite hovering over the gardens made a stoop at me, and if I had not resolutely drawn my hanger and run under me, the thick expiator, he would have certainly carried me away in his talons. Another time, walking to the top of a fresh molehill, I fell to my neck in the hole through which the animal cast up the earth, and coined some lie not worth remembering. To excuse myself from spoiling my clothes, I likewise broke my right shin against the shell of a snail, which I happened to stumble over, as I was walking alone, and thinking on poor England. I cannot tell whether I was more pleased or mortified to observe in those solitary walks that the smaller birds did not appear to be at all afraid of me, but would hop about within a yard distance, looking for worms and other food, with as much difference in security as if no creature at all were near them. I remember a thrust that confidence to snatch out my hand with his bill a piece of cake that Glumdalclitch had given me for my breakfast. When I attempted to catch any of these birds, they would boldly turn against me, endeavouring to pick my fingers, which I durst not venture within their reach. They would turn back, unconcerned to hunt worm or snails, as they did before. One day I took a thick cudgel, and threw it with all my strength so luckily at a linnet, that I knocked him down, seized him by the neck with my both hands, and ran with him in triumph to my nurse. However, the bird, who had only been stunned, recovered himself, gave me so many boxes with his wings on both sides of my head, though I held at arm's length, and was out of reach of his claws, that I was 20 times thinking to let him go. But I was soon relieved by one of our servants, who wrung off the bird's neck, and I the next day for dinner, by the Queen's command. This linnet, as near as I can remember, was so much larger than an English swan. The maids of honour often invited Glumdalclitch to their apartments, and she desired that she would bring me along with her, on purpose to have the pleasure of seeing and touching me. They would often strip me naked from top to toe, and lay me at full length in their bosoms, wherewith I was much disgusted, because, to state the very truth, a very offensive smell came from their skins, which I do not mention or intend the disadvantage of those excellent ladies, for whom I have all the manner of respect, and I little conceive that my sense was more acute in proportion to my littleness, and that those literate persons were no more disagreeable to their lovers, or to each other, than the people of the same quality are with us in England. And, after all, I found that her natural smell was much more supportable when they used perfumes, under which I immediately swooned away. I cannot forget that an intimate friend of mine in Lilliput took the freedom in the warm day, when I was used a good deal of exercise, to complain of my strong smell about me. Although I am as little faulty that way as most of my sex, but I suppose his faculty of smelling was nice with regard to me, as mine was to that people. Upon this point I cannot forbear doing justice to the queen of my mistress, and Glumdalclitch, my nurse, who the persons were as sweet as those of any lady in England. That which gave me most uneasiness upon among these maids of honour, when my nurse carried me to visit them, was to see them use me without any manner of ceremony, like a creature who had no sort of consequence. For they would strip themselves to skin, put on their smocks in my presence, while I was placed in their toilet directly before their naked bodies, which I am sure to me was very far from being a tempting sight, or from being me any other emotion than those of horror and disgust. Their skins appeared so coarse and uneven, so variously coloured when I saw them near, with a mole here and there as broad as a trencher, and hairs hanging from it thicker than a pack-threads. To say nothing further concerning the rest of their persons, neither did they at all scruple while I was by to discharge what they had drunk, the quantity of at least 2 hogsheads, in a vessel that held above 300 tons. And the handsomest among these maids of honour, a pleasant, frolicsome girl of 16, would sometimes set me astride upon one of her nipples, with many other tricks, wherein the reader will excuse me for not being over particular. But I was so much displeased that I entreated Glumdalclitch to contrive some excuse for not seeing that young lady any more. One day a young gentleman, who was nephew to my nurse's governess, came and pressed them both to see an execution. It was of a man who had murdered one of that gentleman's intimate acquaintance, Glumdalclitch, who was prevailed on to be of the company, very much against her inclination, for she was naturally tender-hearted, and as for myself, although I abhorred some such kind of spectacles, yet my curiosity tempted me to see something that I thought must be extraordinary. The malefactor was fixed in a chair upon a scaffold, erected for the purpose, and his head cut off at the blow with a sword of about 40 foot long. The veins and arteries spouted such a prodigious quantity of blood, and so high in the air, that the great jet d'eau at Versailles was not equal for the time it lasted. And the head, when it fell on the scaffold floor, gave such a bounce as it made me start, although I was at least half an English mile distant. The Queen, who often used to hear me talk of my sea voyages, took all occasion to divert me when I was melancholy, asked me whether I understood how to sail or an oar, and whether a little exercise of rowing might not be convenient for my health. I answered that I understood both very well, for although my proper employment had been to be a surgeon or a doctor to the ship, yet often upon a pinch I was forced to work like a common mariner. But I could not see how this was done in their country, where the smallest wherry was equal to the first rate of man of war among us. In such a boat as I could manage would never live in any of their rivers. Her Majesty said that if I contrive a boat, her own joiner should make it, that she would provide a place for me to sail in. The fellow was an ingenious workman, and by my instructions in 10 days finished a pleasure boat, with all its tackling, able conveniently to hold 8 Europeans. When it was finished, the Queen was so delighted that she ran with it in her lap to the King, who ordered it to be put in a cistern full of water, with me in it, by way of trial, where I could not manage by 2 sculls or little oars, for want of room. But the Queen before contrived another project. She ordered the joiner to make wooden trews of 300 feet long, and 50 broad, and 8 deep, which was well pitched from prevent leaking, was placed on the floor of the along the wall. In the outer room of the palace, it had been it had a cock near the bottom to let out water when began to grow stale. The two servants could easily fill it in half an hour. Here I often used to row for my own diversion, as well as that of the queen and her ladies, who thought themselves well entertained with my skill and agility. Sometimes I would put up my sail, and then my business was only to steer, while the ladies gave me a gale with their fans, and when they were weary, some of the pages would blow my sail forward with their breath, while I shewed my art of steering starboard and larboard as I pleased. When I had done, Glumdalclitch always carried back my boat into her closet, and hung it on a nail to dry. In this exercise I once met an accident, which had like to have cost me my life, for one of the pages, having put my boat into tow, the governess who attended Glumdalclitch very officiously lifted me up to place me in the boat, but I happened to slip through her fingers, and I should have infallibly fallen 40 foot upon the floor, if, by the luckiest chance in the world, I had not been stopped by a corking pin that stuck in the good gentleman's stomacher. The head of the pin passed between my shirt and my waistband of my breech, and thus I was held in the middle of the air, till Glumdalclitch ran to my relief. Another time, one of the servants, whose office it was to fill my trough every third day with fresh water, was so careless to let a huge frog, not perceiving it, slip out of its pail. The frog lay concealed till I was put into my boat, then seeing a resting place, climbed up, and made it lean so much on one side that I was forced to balance it with all my weight on the other, to prevent it from overturning. When the frog was got in, it hopped once and a half length of the boat, then over my head, and backwards and forwards, daubing at my face and clothes with its odious slime. The largeness of its features made it appear the most deformed animal that can ever be conceived. However, I desired Glumdalclitch to let me deal with it alone. I banged it a good while with one of my sculls, and at last forced it to leap out of the boat. But the greatest danger I ever underwent in that kingdom was from a monkey, who belonged to one of the clerks in the kitchen. Glumdalclitch had locked me up in her closet, when she went somewhere upon business or a visit. The weather being very warm, and the closet window was left open, as well as the windows and the door of my bigger box, in which I usually lived, because of its largeness and conveniency. As I sat quietly meditating at the table, I heard something bounce at the closet window, and skipped about to one side of the other, whereat, although I was much alarmed, yet I ventured to look out, not stirring from my seat, and then I saw this frolicsome animal, frisking and leaping up and down till he last came to my box, which he seemed to view with great pleasure and curiosity, peeping in at the door and every window. I retreated to the farther corner of my room, or the box, but the monkey looked in every side, put me into such a fright, that I wanted the presence of my mind to conceal myself under the bed, as I might have easily done. After some time spent peeping, grinning, and chattering, he at last espied me, reaching one of his paws in at the door, as a cat does when she plays with a mouse. Although I shifted place to avoid him, he at length caught hold of the lappet of my coat, being made of that country cloth, was very strict and strong, and dragged me out. He took me up in his right forefoot and held me as a nurse does a child she is going to suckle, just as I seen the same sort of creature do with a kitten in Europe. When I offered to struggle, he squeezed me so hard that I thought it was more prudent to submit. I had a good reason to believe that he took me for a young one of his species, by his often stroking my face very gently with his other paw. In these diversions he was interrupted by a noise at the closet door, if somebody was opening it, whereupon he suddenly leaped into the window, which he had come in, thence upon the leads and gutters, walking upon 3 legs, holding me in his fourth, till he clambered up to a roof that was near to the next of ours. I heard Glumdalclitch give a shriek at the moment he was carrying me out. The poor girl was almost distracted. That quarter of the palace was all in an uproar. The servants ran for the ladders. The monkey was seen by hundreds in the courts, sitting upon the ridge of a building, holding me like a baby in one of his forepaws, and feeding me with its other, cramming into my mouth some victuals he had squeezed out of the bag on one side of his chaps, patting me when I would not eat, whereat many of the rabble below could not forbear laughing. Neither do I think I justly ought to be blamed, for without question the sight was ridiculous enough to everybody but myself. Some of the people threw up stones, hoping to drive the monkey down, but this was strictly forbidden, or else very probably my brains had been dashed out. The ladders were now applied, and mounted by several men, which the monkey observing, finding himself almost encompassed, not being able to make speed enough with his 3 legs, let me drop on a ridge tile and made of escape. Here I sat for some time 300 yards from the ground, expecting every moment to be blown down by the wind, or to fall by my own giddiness, come tumbling over and over from the ridge to the eaves. But an honest lad, from one of my nurse's footmen, climbed up, and putting me in his breeches pocket, put me down safe. I was almost choked with the filthy stuff the monkey had crammed in my throat, but my dear little nurse picked it out of my mouth with a small needle. Then I fell a vomiting, which gave me great relief. Yet I was so weak and bruised in the sides and with the squeezes given me by this odious animal, that I was forced to keep my bed a fortnight. The king, queen, and all the court sent every day to inquire after my health, and her majesty made several visits during my sickness. The monkey was killed, in order that no such animal should be kept about the palace. When I attended the king after my recovery, to return him thanks for his favours, he was pleased to rally me a good deal upon this adventure. He asked me what my thoughts and speculations were while I laid in the monkey's paw, I, how I liked the victuals he gave me, his manner of feeding, and whether the fresh air on the roof had sharpened my stomach. He desired to know what I would have done on such an occasion in my own country. I told his majesty that in Europe we had no monkeys, except such as were brought to the curiosities of other places, and so small that I could deal with dozens of them together, if they presumed to attack me. As for that monstrous animal whom I was so lately engaged, it was indeed as large as an elephant, if my fears had suffered me to think so far as to make use of my hanger, looking fiercely and clapping my hand upon the hilt as I spoke. When he poked his paw into my chamber, perhaps I should have given him such a wound that would have made him glad to withdraw with more haste than he put in it. I delivered in a firm note, with a person who was jealous lest his courage should be called in question. However, my speech produced nothing else besides a loud laughter, which all the respect due his majesty from those about him could not make them contain. This made me reflect how vain an attempt it is for a man to endear himself, doing honour among those who are out of all degree of equality or comparison with him. And yet I had seen the moral of my behaviour very frequent in England since my return, where a little contemptible varlet, without the least title to birth, person, wit, or common sense, shall presume to look with importance, and put himself upon a foot with the greatest persons of the kingdom. I was every day furnishing the court with some ridiculous story, and Glumdalclitch, although she loved me to excess, was arch enough to inform the Queen whenever I committed any folly that she thought would be diverting to his Majesty. The girl, who had been out of order, was carried by her governess to take the air in about an hour's distance, or 30 miles from town. They alighted out of the coach near a small footpath in a field, and Glumdalclitch, setting down my travelling box, I went out to walk on it. There was cow dung in the path, and I must needs to try my activity by attempting to leap over it. I took a run, but unfortunately jumped short, and found myself just up in the middle to my knees. I waded through with some difficulty, and one of the footmen wiped me clean as he could with his handkerchief, for I was filthily bemired, and my nurse confined me to my box till we returned home, where the Queen was soon informed of what had passed, and the footmen spread it about the court, so that all the mirth, for some day, was at my expense.